If it's Friday, collision course. As the former president faces a third indictment, a federal judge has just scheduled his second criminal trial, setting it on a course to collide with the presidential primaries and the Republican convention. Plus, another ratcheting up of tensions between the U.S. and China as U.S. officials confirmed to NBC News that China-linked hackers gained access to the email accounts of our U.S. ambassador and a top official at the State Department. And a redistricting fight with supreme consequences, as Alabama Republicans are poised to potentially defy the Supreme Court's ruling that the state's gerrymandering had been illegally marginalizing black voters. Hello and welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Ryan Nobles in for Chuck Todd. The stage is set for a presidential primary season unlike anything we've seen before, with the Republican frontrunner potentially clinching the nomination as he stands trial in not one, but two criminal cases, and maybe more. Today, the judge presiding over Donald Trump's classified documents case officially set a trial date for May 20th, 2024 in Fort Pierce, Florida. Trump's legal team had argued the trial should have been pushed until after the 2024 election. But in a statement, Trump's campaign suggests that they are okay with the date. It comes after Trump's legal team also lost its bid to change the venue of his other criminal trial, the New York hush money case, which is set to begin in March. That means both trials are set to firmly collide with the presidential primary season, smack dab between the January 15th Iowa caucuses and the Republican convention, where the nominee formally accepts the nomination. And if that calendar isn't busy enough for you, there is the increasingly likely prospect of a third Trump trial on the board as he faces a looming indictment in the special counsel's probe into 2020 election interference. Prosecutors heard testimony yesterday from a Trump aide about his state of mind during and after the election. To top it off, we're not done. There could be a fourth criminal trial, too, as we expect charging decisions in the Georgia election interference investigation to come as early as August. So this leaves the Republican frontrunner with battles at both the ballot box and in criminal court, while putting the Republican Party in uncharted territory leading up to election night. Joining me now on set, NBC News Justice reporter Ryan Riley and NBC's Garrett Hake, who's covering the Trump angle for us. Also with us, Renato Mariotti, a former federal prosecutor and legal affairs columnist for Politico magazine. So, Ryan Riley, let's start with you. What should we expect from the legal perspective between now and next May? I assume there's going to be some more court things that we need to keep an eye on.
That's right. This will be this basically gets them on a schedule where there's some deadlines set where they'll have to go through these procedures. I think the difference, though, between setting it in December and setting it in May is significant, though, because often there's something that comes up that sets back a trial. I don't know if that date is actually going to hold. And the later it gets, the closer it gets. By that point, Trump will very likely have clinched the Republican nomination. And it just really gets deep into that period where there are Justice Department rules against, having these ongoing cases against people who are running for office.
So we shouldn't view this as set in stone. There's a good chance it could get
I think it could be flexible. So I think the special counsel's office would have been a lot happier with something in December, because even with that December date, you're sort of anticipating a potential bump back from then. If you bump back from this point in May, I mean, gosh, then you're talking about the middle of the summer, and it just really gets really messy situation for the FBI, for the Justice Department to be in.
It's like when I tell my kids to go to bed at 7 o'clock, hoping they're in bed by 10 o'clock.
Exactly.
Right? That's what we're dealing with here. Okay, so Garrett, from your perspective, is the Trump team satisfied with this date? They said they wanted it after the election.
Yeah, but they also released a statement after this came out, basically claiming victory, saying that the efforts to railroad Donald Trump to give him an unfairly, early trial have been held off. And I think they're keenly aware of Ryan's point, which is that this may not be the final word on when the trial is held. That said, if you have to put your presidential candidate on trial during a campaign season, which is not something any campaign operative would recommend, the parking spot of mid-May is not bad. If you think that Donald Trump's going to have this nomination largely sewn up by then, you've got a bunch of winner-take-all states. It's about when he had it sewn up in 2016. He'd be basically done with the primaries, but not to the convention yet, the kind of post-convention pivot to the general election. That's a period where a lot of candidates either take some time off or do some fundraising. If you have to be in Florida on trial, that's the time period you'd want to do it.
Yeah. So, Ryan, looking at that timeline there, we have a trial in Manhattan that's scheduled to happen shortly before that. We don't know how long that could potentially take. Is there a distinct possibility that he could be facing criminal trials at the same time? Could they overlap?
At the same time, I don't think you can really, because, the courts would sort of deal with that
Even
issue.
though it's a federal court and a state court?
Yeah, I think they would still, deal with that issue overall. I think the broader question now that, when we look back at this, say, 10 years down the road, one thing that we're going to be looking at is why did the Justice Department not act more quickly? And why did it take the appointment of the special counsel to really get this rolling? A lot of these facts, some of it came in through the course of the January 6th investigation, but there was like a year period there where this could have got the ball rolling, and now we're really quickly really staring down the barrel of a really tight timeline here. And essentially what you're going to end up having is the presidential election effectively being a stand-in for a criminal charge here, right? Essentially, Americans are going to end up being the jurors in all likelihood, especially when you consider that we're going to very likely in the next days, weeks ahead see an indictment of Donald Trump, specifically with regards to the January 6th.
You make the point that a lot of this evidence came out in the Select Committee investigation. The Justice Department could have got that information themselves had they started earlier. But to Ryan's point, Garrett, is this a worst-case scenario for Republicans? I mean, we talk a lot about Donald Trump. There's about 10 or 11 other people running for president. This puts it smack dab in this primary season when they'd prefer to be talking about the race for president, right?
Yeah, look, I mean, for Republicans not named Trump, that May timeline is problematic because he could basically, not have anything to do with the trial until all of a sudden it's done, it's locked up, he's the nominee. Oops, we just found out he's convicted, and now that's who we're taking into battle in the general election. That's not a great position to be in for the rest of the party. But if you're a Republican candidate running for president right now and your strategy to be the nominee is still predicated on the Justice Department taking down Donald Trump, I don't know what to tell you. You've not been paying attention because none of these indictments have hurt him. None of what's new news in the investigations has done him any political damage among the Republican primary electorate at all. And I don't know why you would think that would start now just because he's on trial as opposed to indicted, arraigned, and in constant glare of an investigative spotlight.
And to that point, he has a rally next weekend. As these investigations are looming over him, perhaps he's indicted again by that point. He doesn't seem to shy away from engaging on this when he's on the campaign trail.
Certainly not. I mean, he's made it a core element of his campaign speech, this idea that they're coming after me and I'm standing in between, their efforts to come after you. He is as good as any politician in modern history at being essentially a martyr on these issues, making it about, the target of him as a political issue, and that he just scheduled a rally in Pennsylvania on Saturday night, a swing state in a presidential general election, not a primary state. Says to me a pretty convenient location to have a message that says something like Joe Biden's coming after me because he thinks I'm a threat to him. And here I am in a state that he won last time that I'm going to take back.
Yeah. Ryan, we're sitting in this state of suspended animation because the target letter was sent last week, thinking an indictment can come down at any point. But one of his closest aides appearing before the grand jury this week, William Russell. What does that tell us about the stage of this investigation, how close we are to an indictment, and what are we learning about William Russell's testimony? It
tells us a lot, and it was really this really unique moment because you had the lawyer who was representing William Russell, who was actually in that or outside of that grand jury room and was due at a verdict for another separate client of his who was actually also a former Trump aide, but in this case it was someone who actually physically stormed the Capitol himself on January 6th. He ended up being found guilty of 8 different felonies, but Stanley Woodward ended up being 25 minutes late for that hearing because he was dealing with issues of executive privilege that were coming up during William Russell's testimony. It really was one of these, I think, just sort of made for TV moments, although there's no cameras in the courtroom, where he was, walking very quickly down the hallway and going to this hearing as the judge is on the bench. And, that's not something to do with judges. You don't wait. You don't have the judge on the bench when, 25 minutes after a hearing is supposed to begin and leave them waiting. So this is, something that, and the judge in that case, who was also Trump appointed, ended up calling the special counsel's prosecutors down or up rather, I suppose, and talking to them about, what would happen here and essentially wondering if they had misled, I guess, Stanley Woodward in some way. So really unique case, and I think that it highlights that we have a special focus here on questions of executive privilege, really, and getting into that question of what was in the president's mind during this critical period after the 2020 election.
And as we wait this indictment, Garrett, we heard from Donald Trump's new lawyer who's representing him in the 2020 election January 6 investigations. What do we know about this lawyer and the role that they're going to play?
So this is John Lauro. He's another former federal prosecutor turned basically white-collar criminal defense attorney. The news only broke that he'd been hired yesterday, and I find it fascinating alone that he's on Fox News today publicly defending Donald Trump. I don't know that I should be surprised, but this is what Donald Trump wants. He wants warriors out in public defending him in whatever medium is necessary, whether they be political warriors or, in this case, legal warriors. What we heard from Lauro here was two things that were of particular note. Number one, to your point about a made-for-TV moment, that he believes they should have cameras in the courtroom for this, which speaks to your point earlier about Donald Trump not shying away from this at all if he wants to put it on television. And the other to this argument about what was in his mind, what did he know, or what did he think about having won or lost the election. Lauro argued that what he was doing was, in commission of his presidential duties, making sure the elections were properly run. That he didn't ask for anything to be overturned. He simply asked for a delay to make sure that the elections were properly run. The courts might disagree with that. Certainly, we've got countervailing evidence to that, but it's the first time we've seen kind of an affirmative defense from a Trump attorney actually working on this case since we knew that the former president was a target and that we needed to take it seriously.
Ryan, is there any chance the federal court opens up cameras to the courtroom? That's
very
never happened,
unlikely.
right?
Yeah, it's not really a decision that's up to the judge. It's more just a wide policy. There's been a couple of test programs, but most of those have been about civil cases, so I think that's pretty much a non-starter. I mean, even audio would be a real stretch, I think.
There are television executives still salivating at the possibility regardless. Okay, Ryan and Garrett, excellent conversation. Thank you both. We appreciate it. All right, let's bring in Renato now to get his take on all of this. And looking at your legal expertise now, Renato, Judge Cannon, in her order today having to do with the date of this case, seemed to suggest that the special counsel was a little bit hasty with its requested timeline. I want to read to you what she said. She said the government's proposed schedule is atypically accelerated and inconsistent with ensuring a fair trial. And while the government has taken steps to organize and filter the extensive discovery, no one disagrees that defendants need adequate time to review and evaluate it on their own accord. We talked about this with Ryan Riley earlier. You have expertise in courtrooms like these. Do you expect that the trial date will ultimately slide from the date that she selected?
Absolutely. You know, you mentioned up top I'm a columnist for Politico. I wrote a column in early June saying that this case is not going to be tried before the election. I think that column is aged like fine wine. Ultimately, she's done not only what I expect, but what I think a lot of judges would have done here, which is set a trial date for mid-2024. Ultimately, with the understanding that as circumstances develop, there's, for example, issues regarding discovery, potentially interlocutory appeals, which SIPA opens up the possibility of in a case like this, a national security case, or other developments that ultimately that trial date should slide or would slide. And I fully expect Trump's team to do everything possible to continue to try to delay this.
So I'm fascinated at the effort that must go into this on behalf of Trump's legal team, because now they've got to gear up for at least 2 trials in 3 months. There's also the pending possibility of maybe 2 more indictments. How daunting of a task is that, especially when we've seen that the Trump legal team has had a difficulty holding on to their attorneys? How can they pull all of this off?
That's a really smart question, because I think what people are missing, because they're too focused on one indictment or another, one trial or another, they're not focused enough on the multiplicative effect of being on trial one after another, facing not just a war on one front, but facing war on multiple fronts at the same time. You actually have a situation where, you know, for example, Fani Willis can be focused on getting charges in her case and focus like a laser on that, whereas Trump's team has to be focused on, when they make a statement, how will that play in these other 3 courtrooms? And so I think that it just makes it very challenging. I've been in a situation since I've left the government where I've had a client who was facing war on multiple fronts, and it's happened to many others who've all had bad ends. R. Kelly, Michael Avenatti, Harvey Weinstein, lots of people who are facing a trial in multiple jurisdictions. It ends up not turning out so well for them.
And is it your sense that these different courts that are dealing with these different issues, they'll work with each other when it comes to schedule? And we talked to Ryan about this a little bit too. I mean, it's a state court versus a federal court. There could be other possible indictments that come down in federal court. Do these judges work with each other when it comes to a schedule to make sure that everyone gets the requisite time they need?
Well, they don't work with each other. However, the defendant has a right to be able to prepare for trial, and the defendant has to be personally present at the trial or have that right. In other words, a judge couldn't say, I don't care that he's scheduled to be on trial in Manhattan. We're having a trial here in Florida at the same time, because that would basically mean that judge would have to try that case twice, because there's no way you can have a trial where the defendant has no ability to be present. So they're going to take each other's schedule into account, but they're not going to explicitly work together or in a collaborative fashion, which often can create more delay. One judge sets a deadline, then the other judge has to take that into account. It doesn't, fit with her calendar. It ultimately I think, gives more opportunity for the Trump team to play off one judge against the other. Often the defense will try to speed up certain cases and slow down others.
Sometimes I feel when I ask you these questions that we're part of a novel that no one would read because they wouldn't believe the premise. But if we're in a situation here where Donald Trump wins the presidential election and he hasn't even gone on trial yet, which you predict could happen, that the trial would happen after the election, what are the legal ramifications there of prosecuting a sitting president or president-elect?
It is absolutely unprecedented. And I think it's fair to say that it is something that the people who wrote our Constitution, the men, I should say, since women were excluded at the time, who wrote our Constitution, didn't contemplate. I mean, no one contemplated for example, the state of New York or one of its constituent parts wanting to imprison the president of the United States, or the judiciary trying to impose a sentence on the executive branch. I don't think any of this was ever contemplated. People use the term constitutional crisis all the time, but that truly would be one. And I don't think we have a good answer, and anyone can provide a good answer to that question.
And this is not fantasy. This is a potential reality that we are not that far away from having to deal with if all the things play out as they might. Renato, thank you so much for your expertise. We appreciate it. Next, does all the new Trump legal trouble mean the best is yet to come for 2024 rivals like Ron DeSantis? The panel weighs in. Plus, a flashpoint of the climate crisis as wildfires burn near Athens, Greece. In other words, the cradle of Western civilization is literally and existentially on fire. You're watching Meet the Press now. And welcome back. As we mentioned, the Republican presidential calendar got a new date today, not a primary day or a filing deadline, but a second trial date for former President Donald Trump. With Trump's top rivals trailing in the polls and loath to confront him on his legal jeopardy, we could be in for an unprecedented presidential election cycle with a top nominee facing a very real threat of conviction. Joining me now to talk about all of this on set is White House correspondent for Politico and, of course, the co-author of the Playbook newsletter. He's also an NBC News political analyst, Eugene Daniels. Chuck Rocha, who is the co-host of the Latino Vote podcast and the founder of the New Nestro PAC, and former Virginia Republican Congresswoman Barbara Comstock. Thank you all for being here. I appreciate it. Eugene, let's start with you. So it seems as though the judge is trying to find a middle ground here, dealing with the politics, but also dealing with the legal ramifications of all of this. But just purely from a political standpoint, dropping this in the middle of the primary calendar has to be a worst-case scenario for Republicans, isn't it?
It's great for Donald Trump, right? Because he wanted it either very late or after the election had already taken place. But for Republicans, that is likely the time period in which they will know who their nominee will be. It seems to continue to be likely that it's Donald Trump. So think about that. We get to that trial date, and it is the main person for Republicans is someone who's on trial. Independents aren't going to like that. A lot of Republicans aren't going to like that. And there's no going back. There's no take-backsies at that point. You can't now put in someone else. It will be extremely unprecedented for that to happen. And so Republicans are continuing to kind of reap what they've sown over years, which is backing Donald Trump with no kind of way to wiggle their way out of that. And that's why they're stuck in the situation they're in now.
Barbara, I'm thinking back to 2016. You, of course, were a very vocal never-Trumper then. You remain a never-Trumper now. But, there was kind of a very ill-fated effort to try and prevent Trump from getting the nomination, even to the point of the Republican Party convention. To Eugene's point, if he's already wrapped up the necessary electoral votes, but then is potentially on trial or even convicted, is there anything Republicans can do?
Well, I think you're having the prosecutors, Chris Christie and Asa Hutchinson, point out the problems with having somebody, who's going to be the nominee, who's going to have multiple indictments against him. Chris Christie pointed out today that already, even before you have these trials, that 50% of Donald Trump's, campaign cash is going to legal expenses. Now, when you start going to trial, your costs astronomically increase. So if you're Joe Biden, you love this because the money is not going to a campaign. It is going to the lawyers and to the legal costs. So as someone who does not want Donald Trump to ever be president again, I think this is great. He's not going to be spending money on a campaign. But if you're a Republican who actually would like a Republican to win, Donald Trump is going to be spending money on lawyers and on covering his own butt, not on winning an election. So mind what the prosecutors are telling you. This is not. He's been losing for 7 years, and spending money on lawyers and not a campaign is not a winning strategy.
So, Chuck, from the Democratic perspective, is Joe Biden making the right choice by not engaging when it comes to Trump's legal battles, letting the process play itself out and trying to stay out of the fray?
Joe Biden ain't got to say nothing. We're all talking about it nonstop. Every segment of every news channel, it's when somebody is digging themselves a hole, you don't reach in and take the shovel away from them. You let them keep on digging, and that's what's happening right now. In these presidential elections, I've run a presidential election. There's a big problem when you drop this right in between Super Tuesday and another primary because you're having to schedule and do all the others. This is going to be about turnout, turnout. There ain't nobody in America that's going to be persuaded to vote for or against Donald Trump, but they may be persuaded to stay home.
And you worked for Bernie Sanders, who was a candidate who liked being with the voters, being physically on the ground certainly helped him when it came to turnout. If Donald Trump is sitting in a courtroom somewhere, either in Florida or New York, in the midst of a primary, how damaging could that be in terms of his connection with voters?
It's all about momentum in presidential elections. Folks don't understand that from somebody who runs campaigns. In the last Super Tuesday election, momentum alone put Joe Biden over the top. He won states he had no staff in because of momentum. He won states he had never been to because of momentum. There are two different presidential campaigns that happen simultaneously. One is around the candidate with press, and the other one is in the state and in the field. And that's the campaign you're talking about, where he's never there to actually motivate folks to show up to vote.
And when he's in the courtroom, chances are he can't talk. He's going to have to take the fifth. His lawyers are not going to let him speak because he doesn't have a legal case he can make in court.
Despite their efforts to try and get cameras in the courtroom, which probably isn't going to happen. So Eugene, we have some new NBC News reporting that Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who is at this point the strongest challenger to President Trump, strong maybe too strong of a word to describe him, but that's what we're dealing with right now. He's planning on a campaign strategy shift. You've covered so many of these, right? It's almost like plug and play. But, they're going to do more intimate venues. He's going to shake more hands. He's going to do more mainstream media interviews. What does this tell us about the state of his campaign? And is this an opportunity for him to truly have a reset?
It tells us that they realize what they said at the beginning, which we're not going to be talking to the media that we hate, doesn't work. You can't do that nowadays. As much as you can kind of get around reporters, as you can talk to, you can go on social media, you can talk straight to the folks that are on the ground, the people that are going to be voting. At the same time, narrative is so important in primaries. By momentum, narrative creates momentum. He currently has a narrative that people don't like him, that he doesn't have a campaign that can win in a general election, and that he can't beat Donald Trump in a primary. This is the only way to change that, to kind of rejigger things and hope for the best. That's kind of what campaigns are about. And so will this work? We'll see. Because a lot of the problem when I talk to Republican strategists is like, with this campaign, they feel like the candidate is the issue. It's not, how much money they're spending on ads, how many hands he shakes. It's that the candidate might be the issue. And that is something that only one person can fix, and that's Ron DeSantis.
Did you have something to add, Chuck?
No, I was just going to say it's about momentum. When you start talking about the narrative and momentum, to my brother's point, Eugene, that's what happens in a campaign. And it's hard to do that when folks are saying you can't win, you're not Donald Trump. But if they, hey, I just reset my campaign, stay tuned, they're going to do the same thing, but at least they got back out there.
It's a death spiral with him. I mean, the problem is DeSantis. He is not, he's a joyless candidate. He is, it's not just that people don't like him. He doesn't like doing this. He doesn't like being out campaigning. He thought he was somehow going to be anointed. This is not enjoyable for him. He's now doubling down on his culture issues. He's traded in Disney now for he's going to do a Bud Light thing. And you think you can really look at his, he started going down when he went out and did this weak attack on Ukraine. And he couldn't even stand up to Putin. If you can't stand up to Putin, you certainly can't stand up to Trump, we know. So if you can't stand up to Putin or Trump, you're not a leader. He just thought he could kind of get the, endorsements from Elon Musk or Tucker Carlson. How's that working out? Those two disappeared sort of on the scene, and he's going nowhere. I think it's a death spiral.
You're the perfect person to ask this question, Barbara, because it seems as though there may be some desire within the Republican primary to find an alternative to Trump, but none of this field appears to be capturing that energy. Is there someone that isn't in the race yet, perhaps from your state, that could jump in at some point and have an impact? Glenn
Well, I
Youngkin,
think
we're
you're
talking
going.
about.
Well, I think you're going to see some. Well, listen, I think I mentioned Chris Christie. I think he's very joyful out there, having a good time. As he said, you've got to go through Donald Trump if you want to win this race. I think the other candidates are kind of catching on that if you want to, go at Donald Trump, you have to go through them. Are we going to see the other candidates catch on and do that? Because I think we know Ron DeSantis won't. If the others pick up on that, Chris Christie might give them an opportunity to realize that they too can do that. And if they take that opportunity, then I think that's the only path. If you're not going to take on the man, you're not going to be the man.
Part of the problem is that the people that the Trump voters might be interested in, someone like Ron DeSantis, they are not doing that. They're not going out, they're not saying that. And you do have the Chris Christies and the Asa Hutchinsons, the Will Hurds going out there and attacking Donald Trump.
You have to be a leader.
But the voters don't want them. Right? They do not want the Republicans that are pre-Trump Republicans. That has been very clear.
Well, they want a leader. I think you're
you're
seeing some of their numbers come up. Let them get out. Let them debate. See, I think it is having an impact. And so I think as Trump has more and more problems, and you've seen recently there've been 4 polls where Biden is leading Trump. So at a certain point, Trump's been losing for 7 years. How's that working out for us? If you don't like Biden policies, you have to stop picking Trump, who has been losing.
Chuck.
I think that you're right on path. That there's been so much money spent with Republicans to build this brand of Donald Trump. People forget that a lot of this has got people know Donald Trump. Guess what? They knew Bernie Sanders. They knew Joe Biden, who had also been the vice president for Barack Obama. For those of us who do advertising in TV and make mail and digital ads like I do, that branding means something. People know whether they love him or hate him. They know that Trump name on a plane, on a building, on a fine piece of red meat, whatever he's out there selling. But they don't know Ron DeSantis. They see a caricature that they hear people in Congress go, he ain't nice. They hear people report that he ain't even really into this. And then you just see all that break down to a death spiral, to your point. So that branding means something when you've spent hundreds of millions of dollars to build a brand, like it or not.
Okay, great conversation, everybody. Thank you for being here on a Friday. I appreciate it so much. Eugene Daniels, Barbara Comstock, and Chuck Rocha. Coming up, new details on how Chinese hackers breached government emails and got access to the accounts of at least 3 top U.S. officials. That's next. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. We are learning more about the scope of the government breach by China-based hackers earlier this month. U.S. officials confirmed to NBC News that in addition to Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo, hackers also breached the emails of U.S. Ambassador to China Nicholas Burns and a senior State Department official for East Asia. Now, officials say the breach was limited to their unclassified email accounts. The hack of U.S. officials, though, involved in crafting America's policy toward China comes at a time when the Biden administration is looking to cool tensions with Beijing. Our very own Andrea Mitchell sat down with Secretary Blinken today at the Aspen Security Forum and asked him about this hack and America's vulnerabilities. Take a listen.
There is an ongoing effort, quite literally every single day, to make sure that all of our systems are as strong and protected as they can be.
But isn't this a basic attack on our sovereignty? Where do you draw the line?
Again, what we've had occasion to share more than once with China is the concern that anything targeting the government, targeting citizens, targeting companies is a real concern for us.
And we should mention that NBC Universal News Group is the media partner of the Aspen Security Forum. Joining me now is NBC News White House correspondent Ali Rafa. So, Ali, do we yet know what the full scope of this hack is yet? Could there be more senior officials impacted? And is there a concern that this will stall efforts to improve those relations with China?
Yeah, Ryan. Well, Secretary of State Blinken also told Andrea that the full scope and impact of this hack is still under investigation, because at this point we just know that, as you mentioned, that hack that involved Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo, an undisclosed or unknown number of email accounts were involved last month in that hack that affected both the state and commerce departments. And now we're learning of this separate hack that was related that involves these two career diplomats. As you mentioned, that officials are saying that these affected unclassified email accounts. But what makes, in the particular case of these diplomats, that level still concerning is the fact that these two diplomats were heavily involved in Secretary of State Antony Blinken's high-stakes trip to China last month. Remember, he met with his Chinese counterparts to smooth over tensions with China after months of little to no high-level communications following the Chinese spy balloon incident. You add to that China's sort of relationship with Russia as it relates to the war in Ukraine, increased Chinese aggression in the Indo-Pacific region. And because of that, it's still really unclear what's going to happen at the end of this. As we try to smooth over relations with China, as we await the results of this investigation, one big question is what sort of repercussions or consequences could the government put in place on China if they do prove that China was behind, in fact, this hack, the Chinese government, rather. Another big question is whether the government's use of the Microsoft software would potentially change after this. Remember, Blinken said that the government was the one informing Microsoft of this hack. So could the government's use of Microsoft potentially be impacted in the wake of this? So there's still a lot to learn out of this investigation, Ryan.
And Ali, the president also announced some key and historic military appointments. What positions is he looking to fill? And of course, this comes against the backdrop of Senator Tommy Tuberville putting a hold on all military promotions. And the president called Tuberville out in a statement. How significant is that?
Pretty significant. It follows this pattern that we've seen over the last few months, that the Biden administration is fully leaning into what we've seen from Alabama Senator Tommy Tuberville and his blockade of over 250 key military nominations. The president announcing 4 more today, including the nomination of the second ever 4-star female Navy admiral to serve as the key chief of naval operations and on the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The president urging for the Senate to confirm these nominations as soon as possible. And as you mentioned, he did not shy away from calling Tuberville out for the blockade that he's put into effect over the last few months over the Pentagon's abortion policy. The president saying in this statement, in part, quote, "These leadership positions are far too important to delay filling while one senator prioritizes his domestic political agenda over our military readiness. What Senator Tuberville is doing is not only wrong, it is dangerous." And he adds, he is risking our ability to ensure that the United States Armed Forces remain the greatest fighting force in the history of the world, and his Republican colleagues in the Senate know it. The president has repeatedly called on Tuberville's Republican colleagues to stand up against him and urge that these two conditions should not be related, this abortion policy related to the confirmation of these nominees. Some Republicans, including Republicans like Senator Lindsey Graham, have stood by that. But at this point, these nominations still lie in limbo, Ryan.
Okay, Ali Rafa, live outside the White House. We appreciate it. Thank you, Ali. Still ahead, wildfires ravage Greece as the global heat wave brings no relief for rescuers. We're live in Athens with the latest. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. Extreme heat and raging wildfires are plaguing multiple continents right now as global temperatures reach nearly unprecedented levels. NOAA, the U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, announced yesterday that last month was the hottest June the world has ever recorded. June's global average was almost 2 degrees above the 20th century average. This is the first time summer temperatures are more than a degree higher than normal. It is the 3rd consecutive month where global temperatures have set new records. Amid the heat, areas of Europe, North America, and Asia are all experiencing dangerous extreme weather. Wildfires have burned for months across Canada. And the EU warns that Spain, Italy, and Greece are in, quote, very extreme danger as they battle similar fires. A typhoon caused major flooding and power outages in part of southern China this week as well. And in South Korea, at least 40 people have died in flooding from torrential rains that began last week. NBC News correspondent Josh Letterman is on the ground in Athens, Greece. Josh, it does appear that you've got a little bit of relief because it's night there, not nearly as hot as it looked like as it was earlier. But describe for us what it's like right now. What is happening in Greece as they try and contain these wildfires?
Well, Ryan, we spent a lot of the day driving around the region west of Athens that has been the hardest hit in this area by the wildfires. And we saw really two things. One was utter destruction, scorched earth, areas where everything in sight was basically black, from the trees to burnt out vehicles to trash on the ground. But the other thing that we saw was little embers turning back into small fires. And that is exactly the problem that Greek firefighters are dealing with right now. They keep getting these fires under control, but then the heat picks up and the wind gets more intense, and all of a sudden areas that had been contained are reignited and are once again a problem and becoming larger and larger wildfires. And so it's a bit like playing whack-a-mole. They're trying to bring in outside help from other countries, but really this is a problem that they're going to have a hard time getting a handle on until the temperatures come down.
And we know that Greece is just one example of these extreme weather conditions across Europe. Give us a sense of what the rest of the region is dealing with.
Yeah, well, as here in Greece, they prepare for 113-degree temperatures on Sunday. The rest of southern Europe really is struggling with this as well. In Italy, most of the major cities have been under red alert, and we're starting to hear reports about heat-related deaths in a lot of these countries. A 42-year-old Moroccan man in Spain now dead as a result of the heat-related illness. And in many of these countries, including in Italy, they are really concerned about those who are most medically vulnerable, the elderly, young people, as well as those with pre-existing conditions. They say a lot of those people are also the least able to cope with the extreme effects of this kind of heat, and they are worried that the longer this goes on, with many of these people lacking air conditioning, lacking access to heat mitigation strategies, the more illness and death they're going to see. Last year, there was about 60,000 people who died in Europe as a result of heat, according to the WHO. They are predicting that by mid-century, that is going to be double. And so we're seeing this increase year after year. Authorities really trying to tell people to take this seriously, Ryan.
Josh Letterman, live for us tonight from Athens, Greece. Josh, thank you so much. And turning now to the international conversation around climate solutions. As U.S. climate envoy John Kerry visited China this week to push officials on climate policy. I'm joined by David Sandela, who's a former official at both the State Department and the Department of Energy. He's currently the director of the Energy and Environment Concentration at Columbia University. So, David, we've got 3 continents dealing with extreme weather as well as disasters like flooding and wildfires. Are we now seeing proof that this is a global problem? And if so, should we approach it that way?
It is absolutely a global problem, Ryan. You know, July 4th was, according to some scientists, the warmest day ever recorded by human instruments. And around the world, we're seeing remarkable impacts, as your report just showed. It's a global problem, and we need to address it at a global level. There's been some progress in doing that. We have global agreements that have pointed us in the right direction. But as we're seeing this summer, the progress is not nearly enough.
And is this something where the world is starting to actually begin to see the real danger of climate change? It seemed as though this conversation was a bit esoteric maybe 5 or 10 years ago. Are we now starting to see the impact that's happening right in front of us?
We are absolutely. We are living in an age of consequences. We've been pouring these heat-trapping gases into the atmosphere now for almost a century, and now we're seeing the results. You know, there have been heat waves before, of course, but what happens when we pour these heat-trapping gases into the atmosphere is heat waves like this become more likely and they become more severe when they happen. So according to one analysis, this heat wave in the United States is about 5 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than it would have been in the absence of having all these heat-trapping gases in the atmosphere. One of the best metaphors I've heard is it's like playing with loaded dice. When you have all these gases in the atmosphere, all these phenomena are going to be more common. And by the way, it's not just heat waves; it's also flooding, like we saw in the state of Vermont and in other places that you pointed to in your package. When you have more of these gases in the atmosphere, you have both more severe rain events and more severe droughts.
All right, well, let's talk about the efforts to try and address this. Former Secretary of State John Kerry was with Chinese officials talking about climate policy this week. They didn't seem to really make any concrete progress. Are you disappointed in what came out of those talks?
No. This was the first time that Secretary Kerry had met with his counterpart in person in almost a year. And I wouldn't have expected major announcements or major breakthroughs as a result of a meeting like that. According to the report from Secretary Kerry, he spent more than 12 hours talking with his counterpart, went through a lot of detailed topics. These are very challenging issues. So I didn't expect major announcements here. I was pleased that they agreed to future meetings. Hopefully this will lead up to announcements in the months ahead.
And of course, China, the United States are the two largest emitters of greenhouse gas. It would seem that we would need cooperation with China and both America and China agreeing to really deal with this problem. Did they set the tone for their region as much as we set the tone for ours?
Yeah, yes, and I think we both set the tone for the world. As I travel around the world, what I hear is people saying, can't the U.S. and China just work together on this? You're the world's two largest emitters. We need you to be working together. And there's a good history here. President Obama and President Xi agreed on important steps back in 2014. That laid the foundation for a global agreement in Paris the next year. We've proved that we can do this, but tensions between the two countries are so high right now, it's very difficult to move forward.
And of course, there's tensions within the United States as well, because we're still seeing a pretty popular talking point, mainly from the Republicans running for president of the United States, including Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, that China and other countries aren't making the sacrifices in their military or economy for these climate initiatives. So therefore, if the United States institutes them, that makes the U.S. weaker. What is your response to that viewpoint?
Well, but China's a study in contrast here. On the one hand, in China in the past year, there's been more solar power deployment than anywhere else in the world by far. In fact, last year there were 6 times more solar panels installed in China than in the United States, and they're ahead of that pace now. In this year, there's a possibility that if they continue at this pace, there'll be more solar panels installed in China this year than have ever been installed in the United States. So give them credit for that. However, at the same time, they continue to build coal plants in China, and coal's the worst offender when it comes to these emissions. So it's a study in contrast. I think we need to get past the rhetoric and get down to really figuring out how we can be constructive in helping each other move towards an energy transition that the world needs. We've been able to do that in the past, and I believe we can do it in the future if we focus on substance and not on heated rhetoric.
Is that the biggest hurdle, that we sometimes focus too much on the rhetoric and we don't actually talk about what would work to try and solve this problem?
Yeah, look, I think the United States and China have extremely serious disagreements on some very important issues. And there's no question that it's very challenging for two countries with such important differences to work together. But in the past, that's happened. Actually, it went in the depths of the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union worked together closely on global issues, such as healthcare issues. And I believe that U.S. and China can, and U.S. and China must find a way to do that on the global issues that are so important today, including climate change.
So my last question for you is it too late? Are we going to have to deal with this current reality of how difficult the weather pattern is across the country, or do we still have an opportunity to turn things around?
Such a great question, Ryan. It is not too late to avoid the worst consequences of climate change. We're already seeing some consequences, but if we accelerate the energy transition, if we make changes that can both help our economy and cut down on pollution, we can absolutely avoid the worst consequences that might lie ahead.
Okay. Well, glad to end on an optimistic note, David Sandoval. Thank you so much for being here. We appreciate it. Countries are also coming together for a fun reason this week. It's the Women's World Cup. It's in Australia and New Zealand. The reigning champion, the good old United States, is set to kick off its first match at 9 p.m. Eastern against Vietnam. The U.S. team is a mix of familiar faces and newbies. Veterans Alex Morgan and Megan Rapinoe return for their 4th And for Raponi, it will be her final World Cup. While a whopping 14 players are set to make their World Cup debut, the team is looking to make history with a third consecutive World Cup title after the Stars and Stripes won back in 2015 and 2019. No team in women's or men's World Cup history has ever pulled off a three-peat. The tournament really has already gotten off to an exciting and historic start. Both host countries notched opening game wins, with New Zealand marking its first ever World Cup match victory just hours after the country suffered a tragic shooting. Earlier today, Olympic champion Canada was held to a draw with Nigeria. And two legendary players, Canada's Christine Sinclair and Brazil's Marta, are making historic appearances in their sixth World Cups. And I have a daughter who got to see the women's national team here in Washington just a couple months ago. Pretty excited for this World Cup to start. Still to come, it is deadline day in Alabama as lawmakers consider defying a Supreme Court ruling by drawing districts that diminish the power of the black voters in their state. The vote on this just happened. We'll bring you the developments after the break. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. Moments ago, lawmakers in Alabama just passed a new congressional map that Democrats and voting rights activists say ignores the Supreme Court's ruling just last month. During a special session, the Republican majority state legislature recommended a new map that includes only one majority black district, despite a federal court requiring 2 districts where black voters make up the majority or something close to it. In its ruling upholding the lower court's order, the Supreme Court said the state's current map dilutes the power of black voters, who make up about 28% of the state's population. Joining me now is NBC News senior reporter Jane Tim. So, Jane, today is the deadline for their legislature to come up with these new maps. The Republicans here seem to be defying the Supreme Court's ruling. So how much pressure are Republicans in Alabama under?
Republicans are facing an enormous amount of pressure, not only to just maintain the power they have in the congressional delegation, but also from people in Washington who want these lines to do just that. Speaker McCarthy, Senator Tommy Tuberville have been on the phone with the lawmakers who were drawing the lines this week, asking about the process and reminding them of the national sort of debate. I think we have some sound from Senator McCarthy, or Speaker McCarthy, we can play.
I don't know which maps are out there. I have talked to a few to see if they're going to do something about it. We've watched it. We have a couple redistrictings out through all the places. I'd like to know where they're going to go and whether they're in the process of happening.
I'm told that he discussed New York's maps with them because New York Democrats are redrawing their maps and Republicans did very well on the previous maps there. And Democrats are, clearly aiming in New York to eke back some of those seats. Now in Alabama, the map that just passed moments ago is around one. There's one majority black district and one that's about 40% majority black. The plaintiffs do not think this is enough to give black voters a chance to elect the representative of their choice.
And Jane, it seems as though the Republicans are kind of toying with the language in the Supreme Court order, referring to where it says, or something close to it, to justify this map that they just passed. So who decides what's close enough? Is this something that's going to continue to be litigated?
Yeah, there's something quite close to it. Comes from a federal court order, and they're the ones who are going to be deciding this. So this now goes to the court. They will get to have a final say here whether or not they think this is that complies with the order. August 14th, they have a hearing. Plaintiffs tell me they plan to object in opinions in the coming weeks, and then the court will hear. They can decide that if they don't like this map, they can send it to an outside expert and have them draw the maps if they think that will get a better solution for voters in the state.
And of course, you mentioned New York, Alabama. They're not the only states that are dealing with these redistricting challenges. What else can you tell us about these battlegrounds across the country?
Yeah, Ryan, I'm looking at maybe a dozen seats in, say, 6 states, Texas, Georgia, North Carolina, where these redistricting court battles are playing a really outsized role in how the maps turn out. This is why Speaker McCarthy has such close eyes and is monitoring this, because his job depends on whether or not these districts are drawn in ways that can elect members of their choice.
Okay, Jane Tim, excellent reporting as always. Thank you for being here. We appreciate it. And finally today, we want to take a moment to pay tribute to an American icon, Tony Bennett, who died today at 96 years old. He may have left his heart in San Francisco, But Bennett was no stranger to Washington. The beloved singer brought his Great American Songbook to 11 presidents, performing first for Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1956 and later at inaugural events for Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, and Barack Obama. His 1962 White House performance for John F. Kennedy was released in 2013 as one of his more than 70 albums. Tony Bennett, there will never be another you. And thank you for being with us this hour. We'll be back Monday with more Meet the Press Now. NBC News Now coverage continues right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.